All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a great lunch. Thank you so much to HAI and staff and Patrick for organizing this wonderful lunch for all of us. So my name is Djordje Padejski. I'm Associate Director of the John S. Nye Journalism Fellowships here at Stanford, yes. And also lecturer here at Stanford in the journalism program where I teach AI and journalism, the very topic that we'll be exploring this afternoon. So just a shout out, thinking about journalism, switching gears from this morning, just wanted to say that table over there, these are all wonderful JSK journalism fellows here at Stanford. So if you want to talk journalism and with journalists, they're here for a year, and there are a bunch of JSK alums, Subu, Patrick and Kaveh, Alex is there, and Kim over there. Just thank you guys for being here. So obviously, what we heard this morning, the entire day, AI is transforming our society, and in that way, transforming journalism in many, many ways that we are still trying to understand. We hear a lot about the promise. We hear about the efficiency, the ability to process large amounts of data, and so on. But we also, in journalism, observe some of the risks: disinformation, bias, erosion of trust, so go on. So in my class, I often teach and tell my students that discussions about AI and journalism are very much falling in two extremes. There are those who are seeing AI as a kind of revolution, like the Promethean fire, right? Or those on the other side who think that AI is the existential threat to journalism, right? The Pandora's box. Using you, quoting you, Eric.
Greek mythology.
Yes, exactly. But as we all know in this room, the truth is really way more complex, way more complicated. And once we strip away the hype, and both the utopian, dystopian hype, however you want to take it, we can see all the opportunities that AI presents and some of the challenges. So we're really fortunate today that we have a great panel with us to help us kind of navigate some of these questions, each bringing a unique perspective. And from my further left is Rajiv Pant, who is the president of Flatiron Software, but he's also a former CTO. He spent a lot of time in the news industry, former CTO of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Next to me is Professor Clionadh Raleigh, she's a founder and CEO of a nonprofit specializing in conflict data analysis called Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. Next to Clionadh is Eric Schurenberg. Eric is the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media and former CEO of the Fast Company, Inc. And last not least, next to Eric is Troy Thibodeaux. Troy is the director of AI products and services at AP, Associated Press, and he's pioneering efforts to integrate AI at AP. So welcome to Stanford, all of you, and thank you for being here. Sorry about the weather. I think usually here at Stanford we have much better weather than today, but thank you. So we'll begin with brief kind of introductory remarks from each of you. So and then after that I'll ask a couple of questions, and after that we'll for sure open up for questions. So I'll start with Rajiv, with you. So you led technology development at various major organizations, like I said, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So from your perspective, and kind of let's be honest, has AI actually made journalism better? Or just cheaper or faster?
Good question. I would say the very short answer is yes, but it's with an asterisk. So I'll just mention my story with AI in journalism. So these days at Flatiron Software, we build AI systems that help organizations process complex data from multiple sources. That was part of the theme of the discussions earlier, and make better product and business decisions. I also advise a company called ScalePost.ai that integrates media organizations with LLM and AI companies. So over the years, AI has been evolving from a specialized tool into an essential part of journalism, again, with an asterisk. Uh, my experience in AI in journalism began in the 1990s at Night Raider, where we used early machine learning tools to parse classified ads and categorize articles. That work taught me that AI works best when it enhances human capabilities rather than trying to replace them. The same principle has guided my work and implementations across newsrooms. At the New York Times, we used AI to process vast documents, collections of them, identify patterns in complex data. We use machine learning to make predictions and optimize not just digital content delivery when we launched the New York Times digital subscriptions, but also the distribution of physical newspapers. At the Wall Street Journal, we developed systems using generative adversarial networks to detect manipulated images and videos. Our goal was not to replace fact checkers, but to give them better tools to do their work. And AI agents are now changing how people read and understand content. These agents work alongside readers, explaining complex topics in simple terms and adding helpful context, like adjusting explanations based on what the reader already knows. They can pull important facts from multiple sources, check if they are true, and present them in ways that make sense to different readers, all while keeping the journalism accurate and trustworthy. And that, I was find quite interesting in Professor Manning's talk and some of the works that you're working on in Stanford of improving the reliability of RAGs and other things. So that would be key here. What excites me today is fundamentally different from these early applications of AI in journalism. Now we are moving beyond using AI for just analysis and detection and categorization. Think about how we structure news stories. For example, we would write one story, one version for everyone. Sometimes we would personalize the curation of those stories, but we rarely personalize the content itself of the stories. But what if we could write stories using modular components like Lego blocks that AI could intelligently reassemble? Not changing the facts, but adapting how we present them based on each reader's knowledge level. So on this note, when I was CTO of the Wall Street Journal, as a fun personal project, I experimented with this concept using the Amazon Whole Foods acquisition story as a test case. I created different narrative paths, one emphasizing the financial implications for investors, another focusing on local community impact, another on consumer implications. The core article itself remained, the core reporting remained unchanged, but the presentation adapted to serve different audience needs. So it wasn't about creating multiple versions of the truth, it was about creating the truth, making the truth more accessible and relevant to each reader. So this approach requires rethinking how we create content. Instead of, say, creating monolithic articles, we could create atomic content, discrete, verified pieces of information that can be recombined while maintaining their integrity. The journalist's role then would become more crucial, verifying facts, providing context, ensuring the emotional resonance of the story remains across different presentations. So the future of AI in journalism I see is not in writing stories, although I'm sure people will use it to help them write in various ways that I think is that has already happened. But really the core will be in AI helping us tell stories better to reach our audiences more effectively. As we do this, our focus should remain on augmenting rather than replacing human judgment, on enhancing rather than automating the work of the journalists. And I strongly believe that the key to successful AI integration in journalism is in using AI to handle scale, complexity, and some of the difficult tasks like that, but keep human judgment at the center of all the editorial decisions. And I say that both having worked in newsrooms and coming from a family of journalists. So.
Great, thank you. We'll come back to some of the points that you shared, obviously. I want to move to Professor Raleigh, thinking about some of the work that you guys do, especially thinking and trying to kind of spend hours of trying to decode political messages in conflict zones and kind of all the data. But what you guys found is that AI cannot understand cultural nuances. So my prompt to you is, does this mean that AI is fundamentally useless in these environments?
Not at all. Can everybody hear me? Right, great. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. I've learned a lot. So I am not a journalist. I'll start there, because where I come from in this discussion is as somebody who works on conflict patterns. I'm a political geographer. And when I created ACLED, it was so that everybody would have as much data as possible to discern patterns in conflict that they could then use to understand what led to it, how to respond best, who was exposed to violence. And now we release conflict data on events for every country in real time every week. So what we've tried to do is effectively be a personal conflict analyst for people, in which I think actually the AI systems that I've seen discussed today, and of course the work that's being done here, could be unbelievably helpful for, to summarize, to investigate, and even potentially to predict conflict a little bit, with a little bit more rigor actually than I think that we're currently doing it within conflict analysis. But I do want to note that from where I sit, my biggest worry is not necessarily things like it's going to take over our lives, which, you know, I'm worried about it, but it's not my first worry. It's that people might believe generative AI information over really difficult to source, really hyper-local information that takes a lot of time and effort and insight to gain information from. And I had an example that we discussed on a call recently, which I think is really instructive, which is that if I was going to cover, for example, mob violence around Indian elections, I am overwhelmed with the amount of information about every single event, right? My researchers in India are not necessarily fighting for details. They're fighting to get through the amount of information they have in front of them in order to be able to discern, did it happen in this neighborhood and how many happened in this other neighborhood? My biggest concern is that if I was sitting in Bishoftu in Ethiopia and somebody is speaking to me about a rumor going around about who killed whom in Ambo, which is 100 miles down the road, and they are relaying this information through a metaphor, and it's very important information, right? They can't speak directly because the government has taken a maybe less than permissive view to journalism lately. And that interaction is not something that I can ever hope to be able to capture through some sort of generative AI system or even some sort of automated data system, which are totally taking over quite a lot of the conflict data systems more generally. There is a sense that data should be free and open and quick and cheap, right? But we're never going to make it those things. If you want really good data, you're going to have to make sure that the people collecting it have the insight in order to discern what a rumor is and what a report is. Is it likely that these people actually committed this act, or is it most likely because this source tends to blame everything on, let's say, Darfuris rather than the people who likely committed the violence itself? We need people to do it. And I would fully agree that what we do need is an ability to crawl and discern certain types of media to be able to make it quicker and easier to take the conclusions of those excellent reports. But we also need to understand that the premium of researcher insight has to be something that we also appreciate as much as the model itself, right? Which I think that where we will go in, especially in terms of conflict data, is in recognizing that the additional kind of trust that you can assume with an expert having looked over the model or an expert having looked over those data is worth all the time and effort it takes to do it. Because of course, I think that especially with conflict data, the conclusions or the likelihood that you might actually make a serious mistake if you've gotten it wrong are enormous, and it happens pretty frequently. So I think it's great. I'm sold. I'm in.
You're in.
Yes.
Thank
yes.
you.
But I do think that there needs to be a kind of almost sector differentiation about when and how it can be used and how much trust we have in it when it is being used for different topics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Eric, so you and I have been talking that AI has been obviously shaping the media industry for years. So not, long before the generative AI showed up. So from ad tech to social media, right? So we've already seen how AI can influence journalism. So often to the industry detriment, I would add. And I think you would agree. So from your perspective, what lessons should news organizations take from those first kind of encounters with AI? What did we learn from kind of the relationship we had with AI companies?
Okay, well, thanks. Can you hear me? Yes. Am I audible? Okay. Thank you for the question. I'll just say a little bit about where I'm coming from. I was, for many decades, a journalist, an editor, and a writer, and a reporter for a number of business titles that you've probably heard of. And then I crossed over to the dark side and became the CEO responsible for P&L and everything like that. So I worked, unusually for this profession, I worked both sides of the aisle. So I think the answer to the question about what did we learn from our first encounters with AI depend on what it was where that encounter occurred, was on the business side or the newsroom side, and what were your goals in the use of AI. So I'll start first with the business side, and that is where I get to say that, as someone does on every one of these AI panels I've ever been on, is that everyone thinks AI started with generative AI in the fall of 22, but actually we were using it for years. And where I encountered it as the CEO of Inc. and Fast Company was in two main areas. One was ad tech, and the other was propensity modeling for subscriptions. And we did not call it artificial intelligence there, but it was but it shared all of the earmarks that we recognize of artificial intelligence, which was, probability modeling and forecasting, and also a couple other things that I think are the lessons that we want to take away as we look forward to the future of AI. One is that it makes mistakes. It gets things wrong. It's not a total solution. So the data that we experienced at Inc. and Fast Company on propensity modeling was that your subscription offers that were run through an AI machine were maybe 8% or 10% better than, just doing it kind of offering the same offer to everyone who came to your website. And on ad tech, it's not a surprise to anyone here that ad tech is a scam. It is ridiculous. And for those of us who remember, okay, good. I always have one fan somewhere. You only have to look at how many ads for Disney World show up on Breitbart or ISIS recruiting sites to recognize that the idea that you can target audiences with the kind of pinpoint precision that ad tech claims is nonsense. Ridiculous. So, in some cases, depending on the database, ad tech is very good at targeting it. How many small businesses have been kept afloat by Facebook and its greater advertising efficiency. But the kind of ad tech that worked for us with our database at Inc. and Fast Company, it just wasn't good enough. So those are the two things to keep in mind about the limitations in terms of sort of efficiency and targeting and all the claims that are made about AI, in my experience. In newsrooms, my impression from talking to journalists is that AI adoption has been very slow and kind of random and sort of a version of BYOT. I was talking to a CEO just last week who was trying to prompt innovation using ChatGPT by offering incentives to his newsroom to come up with something. Just use it. Come up with it in your spare time. And if you come up with a plan that makes your journalism better, then we'll give you a reward. But it wasn't like the leadership had any particular idea in this case, and also that they were using off-the-shelf technology. It was going to be Claude or ChatGPT or another one of the foundational models. I believe that this is changing, and some of the technologies that you've heard about today suggest that there are great strides to be made for journalism in data aggregation and analysis. But right now, it seems that the use is kind of slightly more efficient, but that nothing replaces the need for reporting that Clionadh was talking about, the need for human judgment. And I'll put in one last statement about trust, because I care a lot about that as the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media. The elements of trust between an audience and a newsroom are threefold, I would say. And this is based on sort of data that psychologists have gathered. The audience needs to believe that you are competent to deliver the news, that you do that with integrity, and that you have their best interests in mind. Now, when you think about that level of trust, AI at the moment kind of goes 0 for 3. Everyone knows that the large language models hallucinate, so do you believe that they're competent? I hope your newsroom doesn't, because it really needs to be checked. It's very good for first drafts or kind of intern level work, but you can't trust it totally to be totally competent at doing a journalist's job. Does it work with integrity? Because just like with ad tech or propensity modeling, it's a black box. We don't really know what prejudices are built into it, so is there integrity there? And finally, does a bot work in the interests of the audience? And I think you can only generate that kind of faith in an audience with a human-to-human interaction. You need journalists who are visible and transparent to their audiences, and without that, you cannot have the faith that they're really acting in your interest.
This is great. Thank you, Eric. And we'll need to get back to that for sure, unpack. But let's just give Troy a chance to do his introduction. So Troy, AP has been really ahead of the curve when it comes to integrating AI in the work. It's been more than 10 years since AP started automating financial stories, right? Using the kind of basic AI, so to say, to, which kind of led us to generative AI and what we can do. Could you talk about some of the kind of most promising work that you guys are using in sort of like news gathering and some of the tools that you've been building? I think that would be great to kind of start off.
Sure, I'd be happy to. First, I just want to say I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for having me. And I wanted to thank the panelists and the presenters from earlier. I'm a failed academic, and so hearing that kind of conversation, those kinds of ideas and exploration, it's just incredibly exciting. And I've got a bunch of use cases bubbling, so I'm going to be bugging you later on. But as you mentioned, AP has been using natural language generation for more than 10 years now. Earnings reports, sports stories. Importantly, though, this is a deterministic technology, right? And so same input is always going to give you the same output.
Right.
Even so, it took us quite a while to get comfortable publishing that stuff directly. It was all still going through an editor, and then it was being audited. Now it's mostly fully automated, but it's only certain content, and only after a lot of testing. And that's with a different. It's not generative AI. It's not an LLM. So, but I do think that the work we did there really gave us a foundation to think about the issues. Right? We had a way of talking about adopting this kind of technology that I think has served us pretty well as we've begun adopting generative AI. And we think about kind of ways that it can be useful across sort of the life cycle of news, and thinking about the ways that it's helpful in news production, right? We think about ways that it's helpful in news gathering, think about ways that it's helpful in news distribution and presentation. And I think they're really fascinating use cases across that entire life cycle. We started, a couple of years ago when I started doing this full time, and LLMs were really kind of becoming mainstream. We started with some common pain points and kind of a lot of stuff that other newsrooms have done. So we did translations in Spanish and Portuguese. We did headline suggestions. We did summarization. We did shot listing from videos. We had been doing transcription for a while. So those are common use cases, and we found that we've been successful with them. But importantly, it's always meant, as you mentioned, to augment our journalists, not to replace them. And I will say, when I've seen the serious missteps in the industry, it's often been with the end to replace journalists. And that really hasn't gone very well in the examples I've seen so far. So we've really been cognitive of that. We've really thought about it's going to be an augmentation. It's going to be a tool that people are going to use. Also, there's a human in the loop. Our standards team, I had the great privilege of being able to work with them on the style book chapter, work with them on our guidance. And right now our guidance says nothing generative is going directly to audiences. Everything is going through a human at the end. And something like, for example, translations, which is in data science, is kind of that's a solved problem, right? Translation's not interesting anymore to data scientists, maybe. But for us, thinking about what it means to translate an AP story from English to Spanish isn't just about translating the words. We have to do cultural translation as well. We have to think about the context. And so those translators are adding a lot more there. So those use cases are interesting. And I think there's some fascinating use cases. And I want to talk to you later about the modular journalism idea. And Stanford has done some work on that as well. I think in presentation, personalization, customization, they're incredible use cases there. But I'm really focused right now or interested in the news gathering use cases. And so we're doing a few things that really can help stretched journalists work more effectively, help them do stories that maybe they weren't doing before. So one example is we have a democracy team that has to pay attention, especially to podcasts from the political fringes. And they were spending an inordinate amount of time every week checking to see if there was a new podcast, running it down, seeing if there's any news there. And the answer often was nope, no news there. Nothing that's really going to make its way into mainstream political discourse. But occasionally, there was something that starts to bubble up in these fringe podcasts that they needed to know about. So we created a system that can identify when a new podcast is dropped, transcribe it, summarize it, track keywords across it, send them an email saying, here's what's happening on this podcast. Then they can go back into the transcript, find the references that they're looking for, listen to the audio to confirm what they're seeing. And so there's a really kind of a whole verification cycle around it, but that alert, that monitoring system is incredibly helpful. And we're finding that's the case in other things as well. We're doing the same for public meetings. So taking public meeting videos and being able to transcribe those and being able to make them searchable. Same thing with like school board meetings. And with school boards, it's interesting because with public meetings, you're really focused on, I'm a reporter, I want to keep track of this governing body, I want to be aware of their meetings. The school boards, we're interested in kind of what are the patterns that are developing, right? So we're seeing all the school boards across the country, what are they talking about now that they weren't talking about last month? And so if we can see those kinds of patterns emerge, we see things that are going to enter into the national discourse. We've developed a project that we call Local Lead, and that starts with the Federal Register, which Monica was mentioning earlier about the signal to noise ratio. And the Federal Register, if you're familiar with it, there's a lot of noise in there. Every incremental change to regulations or executive actions goes into the Federal Register. But occasionally there's something that's really interesting and newsworthy that pops up in there. And it might be something that's not trumpeted by the administration. It might be something that's kind of just snuck in. A regulatory change that looks not very interesting, but if you dig into it, it actually is newsworthy. So we created a system that looks at the Federal Register and looks for newsworthy, and we've kind of worked with the developers, working with a team called Applied Excel, working to develop a sense of newsworthiness across these things, and then looking for relevance to locales. So we're able to provide state-level feeds and saying, here's some regulation that's coming down the pipe. We think it's interesting for your audience. And so we've taken that Federal Register entry, rewritten it as a news tip with a newsy headline and with context in there that says, this is why it might be relevant and interesting to your readers. So we're doing lots of things around kind of monitoring, diving into big data, separating the signal from the noise. I think that we just see incredible potential for that. But also, as folks have mentioned, we're aware of the risks. And when we think about this a lot, when we talk at these kinds of conferences, we talk often about hallucination. It's a very real risk. We talk often about bias in the training data, incredible risk. There's another risk that I think is really interesting, which is automation bias, which is, those of you who are specialists in this will know the term, But when I discovered, like, that explains something to me. It's that the machine's probably right. The machine's right often enough that you begin to expect that it's going to be right. And my favorite example of this was with spell check. And I had a boss, previous job, who was a terrible speller. And so he would just accept everything in the spell check as it came through. And so he sent a company-wide email saying, I'm going to be out for the next 2 weeks. I will be hiking the application trail. Which, but it's that willingness to just kind of, it's probably okay, I'm just going to accept it. And I think it's an interesting design challenge, right? How do we design these tools so that we keep journalists critically engaged and we try to mitigate that automation bias? So I think that every one of these risks, if we think about it, the things I heard this morning were really exciting. The risk of hallucination becomes an opportunity for design and new kinds of interfaces. And I think with all of these risks, if we think about them from that perspective, it's a really interesting field.
Great. So are these any of these tools? I was just wondering. Sorry, are any of these tools available to only AP journalists or other journalists?
Yeah. So the public meeting one actually was done, I should have mentioned, in collaboration with Michigan Radio and the University of Michigan. It's called Minutes. That's available now to newsrooms, both AP members and customers, and not. Local Lead, so that's the Federal Register feed. That's available to AP members and customers. The other tools that we're developing, we're trying to see, is there an interest, is there a market, are there collaborations? So trying to see how we can take these tools beyond the confines of AP. I think that's going to be an interesting thing to think about this year.
Great. All right. So let's talk about, several of you said accuracy, hallucinations, and all of that. And I think that's sort of like one of the fundamental problems that journalists have, like when it comes to AI, right? So obviously, Monica quoted the recent BBC study a couple of days ago. They found really that over half of their responses are related kind of to news-related queries contain significant inaccuracies and distortions. So if we agree, I hope we all agree here, that the core mission of journalism is truth-telling, right? So how can we really trust LLMs? And I'm going to, Eric, what you said. How can we trust LLMs that are really inherently probabilistic? Even though thinking about models that Professor Lambs are building here, so how can they play kind of the meaningful role in that mission of journalism?
I'll start. Yeah.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I suppose one of the first ways is, of course, to have a closed system. So they, it's coming from a corpus that you've previously identified and secured. I think that's really important. I was chatting with Monica yesterday, and she said, I think that the models don't like to say, I don't know. And so they will fill in if they're confronted with it. And I'm sure that's something that can be changed in design to allow for more incomplete answer, or rather an incomplete question leads to a somewhat incomplete answer, and you can refine the question. But I do think that there's something to be said about that there's likely going to be widespread acceptance of these models. And so how we feature as an extra layer of verification and trust, either through the organization or through, like we mentioned before, through sector rules or some sort of way in which people can feel more confident in using it, even if I think that people often don't feel confident when they don't like the answer, but they actually might not have that type of reaction to an automated conclusion. They might accept that the answer doesn't, let's say, confirm their priors, but as long as they're confident in it, they might be more willing to think about what it's told them compared to a person. And they'll just say, oh, that person must disagree with me, therefore they're wrong. So there's opportunities there, is how I'd put it.
Great. Rajiv, you had a...
Yeah, one thing I want to say first is, Professor Monica Lamb, your work is fascinating, so I'm interested in exploring that further to refine solutions. In the meantime, I would also add that this issue exists in journalism, this challenge, but also in other companies. So for example, at Flatiron, we have this product called Snapshot Reviews that reads the code written by all the software engineers and relates it to business use cases, relates it to the project management tools, and understanding if the code that the engineers have written actually meets the business needs or not. Is it high quality code? And just like journalism, the software code is changing all the time. So traditional approaches like, say, fine-tuning a model to add all this content in are, at least at the current cost levels, ineffective, because if you do that, then every day, say, a whole new set of articles came in a publication, or a lot of new code came in that the Snapshot product now has to add to our knowledge base, it becomes challenging. So the solutions that I would say are in this area, really, I put them in two broad categories. One is to bypass the issue, so which is to use LLMs for things like assembling atomic content, doing other things where it's not actually writing the content, but it's taking pieces that are carefully written, vetted, fact-checked by journalists, and simply modifying the curation of the article content itself. So that is one case. There are many such other use cases where the generative capabilities of an LLM can be used, but carefully, and then also double-checked by, if you have the resources, to run it by multiple. So I wrote an open source LLM system that feeds my questions through multiple different LLMs, then has one LLM compare this. So in some ways similar to sort of a mixture of experts approach, but then you can get more chances of knowing if something is correct or not. So one is bypassing, but then the other, which I'm deeply interested in, is, I think, the work that your teams are working on, is how do you reduce the hallucinations using carefully crafted prompts, using, when the results come back, running it through another filter. And I also have some faith that because this is such an important issue, while we work on methods to work around it, the LLM companies are also going to constantly deal with this issue and improve it.
Right.
So it's going to get better.
Right. I mean, since ChatGPT was launched, I heard so many times that, journalists should build their own LLM and kind of to fix this accuracy problem. And Troy, you and I talked about journalism and many other disciplines have zero tolerance, right? And so how do you kind of navigate that?
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to the idea of a journalism LLM, by the way.
I know.
I think it's an interesting one, and it's one that we're talking about. But I think my background's in data journalism, right? And when I think about it from a data journalism perspective, and I think about the kinds of use cases we had, there are use cases where false positives are, cause irreparable harm, but false negatives, less so, right? And if that's the case, you can adjust. What's the difference between false? So, say for example, I want examples of. Actually, give me examples of. Give me examples of hate speech in this text, right? And so, identifying that hate speech. If I find now, you can ask the question: what if I don't get them all? Is that the bigger risk? Or what if I identify a non-hate speech phrase as hate speech? Is that the bigger risk? And I think those cases where we're less worried about, all we're trying to do is find some examples. And we're used to this. We're used to saying we can't grasp every atom in the universe. We talk about the things that are known. And we have these kind of hedge words, right? At least this many, and we describe our methodology, we describe our universe. So I think in terms of news gathering, those kinds of use cases where we don't have to have it all. And we acknowledge that we don't have them all. But the ones that we do identify, we can vet. That a human can come back and look at each of them. Those kinds of use cases become much safer. You can really reduce the risk. So thinking about the ways, there's not just human in the loop, which I think is essential. And we all think about that and talk about it, but what's the role of the human in the loop? Right. How do you keep them engaged, right?
I mean, that's exactly what Cheryl has been talking about, Data Talk this morning. But there was a lot of work to kind of, I don't know where Cheryl is here, but yeah, sorry, you were sitting over there. But students have done a lot of the work to do, manual work to do the fact checking as a result of that. So there's that component. Anyway, so Eric, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I would draw from the Alliance for Trust in Media's experience with Chicago Public Media, which is one of our newsroom partners. And there the idea was to use a texting exchange between the migrant community in Chicago and the newsroom of the Chicago Sun-Times. And it would be automated so that people could ask, say, what's the best way to get a green card? Is ICE going to pull my kids out of school or something like that, and there wouldn't need to be a live reporter to answer every one of those questions. But that experiment kind of ran aground against the same kind of thing that we've found at Fast Company with our propensity modeling, is that the model is only as good as your data and as voluminous as your data. And that's a problem for newsrooms, which have a limited amount of data, even in an extensive archive, but also have a much more, as you said, a zero tolerance for mistakes. And so I think that that's going to be one of the problems with creating sort of a newsroom only, a journalism only LLM. Troy, you know much more about this than me, but my sense is that, like Rajiv said, the answer will be somewhere, and also like AP's current practice, is that there is nothing that goes directly from a model to the audience.
I do want to just mention that, of course, experts also disagree. So it's not as if like any sort of model is going to give you the one answer that everybody would be considered correct. And so there's always a little bit of negotiation with an audience or any user to say, this is what the data are saying, rather than this is the only cause of conflict or likely route for ISIS expansion or whatever the case, because, I might have one opinion and somebody else might have another.
I want to add this concept of a journalism-specific LLM. I've done some experiments with it, so I'm quite without going too deep into the kind of proposed architecture. When I mention at a high level, one effective way to make it work, right? The challenge is if we start something from scratch, the technology still isn't there, despite DeepSeek and the lower cost of training an LLM from scratch. It's going to be hard to compete with the commercial and open source systems. So a better architecture to create a journalism-specific LLM, if you will, would be, so the extremes are, one, you use RAG, but that has issues. Fine-tuning gets too expensive, and building a whole LLM from scratch is challenging because you'd have to really compete with the bigger companies. So one could have an architecture where you have a core LLM that could be, say, Llama or DeepSeek or something else. And then there's another layer which not exactly the same way a mixture of experts works, but what happens is you ask the main LLM, that provides you the bigger corpus of the world knowledge and all the reasoning, all the things that we don't want to develop for a journalism-specific LLM because it would be cost prohibitive. But then there is this journalism-specific, it's not really an LLM, but it's like an add-on to the LLM. And this add-on layer then takes and processes all the information that was given by the source, the big main LLM, and then engages in a dialogue with that other LLM and then makes the final call. So this journalism specific, I don't know if I would necessarily call it a traditional LLM, but this AI agent, this system, would have all the rules for fact checking, all the journalism related guidelines, principles, ethical guidelines, all those other things. And this other AI agent would finally give the results. So that, I think that architecture would give you the same effect as a custom journalism specific LLM without having to rebuild things that OpenAI, Anthropic, Llama have already built.
Sounds like very much to what Professor Lam is trying to do to me, right? It's a good segue. Anyway, I want to go into something that Eric said, the access to data, and kind of acknowledge the uncertainty and reality that we all live now, especially the last couple of weeks. Many of the government websites have been taken down and the data is going down, and just to kind of acknowledge that and think about in the context of AI and doing journalism with no data around. And so what are the thoughts on that? Because we're implying that everything's going to be available, right? There's a journalist, like the Federal Register, as an example, is going to be available, right? So we're assuming that.
I mean,
Sorry, this is one of
No,
those. I told you guys this is going to be a Trump question.
This goes directly to my background because there are these things we start to take for granted. I mean, when I teach data journalism, I mean, my contention is that every beat is a data beat. And every story could have a data angle. And so what I ask reporters to think about when I'm teaching this is, what about this story is countable? Who is counting it and why? Start from that, right? Often the answer to that is somebody in the government is counting it, has been counting it for X amount of time, and if we can't rely, we can't start to take that for granted. With a government data source, you don't question things like provenance, right? I mean, we've found plenty of errors in government data sets. But we do start to take that for granted, and we begin to build a discipline around it and the availability of that information to tell us about our country, to tell us about ourselves. Without that, it's hard to imagine we can do. I can't imagine we could have done 98% of the stories the data team did when I was at AP. So it's incredibly valuable.
Thanks. We wrote an article once about bias across conflict data, and there's always the presumption of the absence bias. So we didn't have the information, and so therefore the data are incomplete. But for the most part, you can mitigate the absence bias with a lot of work, but it can be done. So you can make sure that you have all local languages. You can make sure that you have a lot of local sources and stringers and all the rest of it, because we encounter, in our case, quite a lot of data blackouts, or at least maybe traditional journalism blackouts, and you have to produce something, right? Even if your more traditional sources have gone down, and it just requires you to dig a bit deeper. But in this particular case with the US, and in particular USAID, what ends up happening is that we won't hear about very important, let's say, follow-on issues around development. Like, we won't hear about how many children didn't get vaccinated. We won't hear about how many children didn't get food, or whatever the case. And my worry is that's information that there are a lot of people that are perfectly fine with us not hearing about it. And so we have to be very resilient and, of course, have a lot of diversification in how we're getting the news source, which is one of the reasons that I am especially worried about the big data kind of trawling method of collection, because if there's an absent spot, it's coded as nothing's happening here, rather than the circumstances have changed so drastically that an information pool has disappeared. And that does require, again, it requires somebody who knows the situation to say, this cannot be applied to this particular context for this reason.
Can I just say how weird it is that we're sitting up here and discussing data from the US government?
I know.
As if it were soon to be like data from the Somali government or...
Yeah.
Oh, I should not generalize. But just a comment of how
I'm originally from
head-spinning.
Serbia, okay? I was a Serbian reporter before my life at Stanford, and I always look at the FOIA requests and FOIA from the accessibility, and now like I cannot grasp it. Yeah, it's unbelievable, right?
Yeah, as Troy
And
said.
it's not Serbia or Somalia.
I'll be guided by you guys on that, but it's just kind of mind-boggling. And indeed, we have taken a lot for granted.
Rajiv, you want to jump in? No? Okay, so I actually wanted to kind of follow back on, you mentioned DeepSeek, and this morning we heard a lot about kind of open source models and kind of closed and private models, which is very kind of important distinction when we think about, but specifically going back to DeepSeek, and we all know what it caused, like the market kind of reacted, but thinking about what it also represents in terms of the cultural values that are kind of different from some of the values that we have here. I mean, I personally double-checked DeepSeek, and it didn't want to give any historical information about Tiananmen and any of the events, right? So, like, obviously, there will be highly censored LLMs, even though if they're open sourced. So how do you feel about that in the context of journalism?
I think one approach is certainly to use multiple, because it's not just DeepSeek or an LLM coming from a particular country that's going to have a bias. Our own LLMs, and depending on the direction our country takes, could also develop other kinds of biases. So if the benefit with open source is that the price will come down significantly. So let's say if I had a system and I was building this journalism LLM, the way I would architect it, I would run DeepSeek. In parallel, I would run Llama. I would run some other open source models, preferably from based on their diversity. So, and then this agent, the journalism LLM layer, could actually compare the results of all of them and use their different biases to remove the bias. And you could use a mixture of experts kind of approach, where if the question is about, say, China or certain things, you wouldn't send it to DeepSeek, you would send it to Llama. When there's a question about Facebook and its impact on the world, you might send it to DeepSeek. So you can get answers, with this kind of an approach, and that's why open source is good, because you can examine it. With OpenAI, which is not open source, or Claude or others, you don't really know. And I have several times found when I use Google Gemini, it will refuse to answer questions that seem completely benign and simple and nothing to do with politics or anything, but it figures out that they are not. So, it's not commercially viable to license all the commercial ones, and all the US commercial ones are frontier models. They could all have our American biases. So if you use a combination of open source ones from various different countries, different jurisdictions, you could get really good results.
That's the same advice that I give my students in my media literacy class about consuming news they read in their newsfeed.
But I think also there was a point made earlier this morning that these are large language models and not large knowledge models, right? And so our use cases all are about generating language. Now, the bias in the training data affects just the generation of the language. You can't completely separate language from knowledge. But when it comes to facts, because of our zero, we have such a low tolerance for inaccuracy in our profession. I want to know the source of every fact in my story. I want to be able to annotate every fact in my story. So I don't rely on the language model for the facts.
That's great. Eric?
Those were agreement sounds.
Okay. So thinking about, again, the role of news organizations that are playing, and we heard, again, obviously, this morning discussion about copyright revealed one of those relationships, right? The Thomson Reuters won that case, and we have a bunch of news organizations in kind of litigation with AI companies, right? So that's one way to look at the AI, and the other way to look at the AI, AP, for example, has a licensing agreement. So in that context, what do you think what kind of role news organizations should play in this AI world?
So this is a complex question where the answer depends on kind of which perspective. I would say personally, I'm looking at it, right? Mm-hmm. So from the perspective of the industry, and this company Scaleforce that I've been advising for a while, they're focused on solving this problem, making sure that the licensing, the rights, and media companies' content is properly compensated for when used by others. At the same time, from a personal perspective, many people would feel that something that furthers human knowledge, or if you're training, let's say there was an open source LLM, which is not commercial, but is actually going to be used to create cures for diseases, solve complex problems in this world, could one argue that model's creators who are not commercializing it, only using it to benefit humanity, should they have the right to take all kinds of copyrighted content?
Use, right.
Yeah, fair use, right? Because if it's going to cure cancer, would that be okay?
Right.
So that's kind of a more society, politics, complicated question. But this first part of what you mentioned, I think from the industry perspective, it is important that the journalism companies are able to be compensated for the hard work they do. Otherwise, it will end. It's this example because earlier someone talked about how a lot of content in the future will be synthesized. The problem with that is it's similar to the pre-nuclear testing steel. So, for example, if someone wants to build a particle accelerator like the one here at Stanford or at CERN, you have to find steel from ships that were sunk long before nuclear testing began in the world, because all the other steel everywhere else that you can find or even get from the mines is contaminated. So only deep in the ocean, the old shipwrecks, that steel is pure. So the content is similar. So all the content that was created before ChatGPT is authentic human-created content, but the future content
Wonderful point.
is contaminated.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. Thank you.
I mean, I have an easy answer from AP. Licensing content.
No, I'm
is
not
our
going to ask
business.
you how much. Yeah.
I mean, we license content. It's
Yeah.
our business model, and therefore OpenAI should pay us, and they did, right? And that's I think we said
We don't know how much, by the way.
I don't know how much, so that makes it easy for me to not say anything I'm not supposed to. But no, and what's the value of our content? How is that going to be priced? These are things how do you know? It's an entirely new market. But I think it was an important development for us to be able to say we should be paid for the content. All of our members and customers pay us to use our content. So should the technology companies. And so I think that was a positive development. I also think, and I'm not sure what the window for that usefulness is. I do think that high quality language data remains valuable. Is it going to be as valuable at that scale for these companies long into the future the way that it is now? I don't know. But I know that now it's very valuable and it costs us a lot to produce it. So yes, we should be paid for it.
Oh, thanks. So I have a bit of a scattered answer to this. One is that my sense at the moment is that, of course, I produce data and I give it away for free, but it also has to generate enough income so that I can hire everybody to generate the data. So it's a bit of chasing my tail. But I will say that when I look at AI-generated content, it's very homogeneous, right? And where we find information, especially for conflicts, in deepest Philippines, it's very heterogeneous how those different sources present the information. And so there's no way that it can be easily overtaken by a model that will then produce the exact same information. And so my point there is that there's always going to be a need for unique information that is not generated from AI that tells us something different than what the homogenized generative AI would. But in addition to that, what I guess I would say here is that the consumption habits of people for news that is too homogenous is a bit of a worry for me, because when you see about how people are actually consuming news, they're looking for very different ways to hear or see information. And I think that people's tolerance for somewhat generated media is going to be high when it's interesting and new, and relatively low when it's the way that they're supposed to consume actual information. But I just wanted to talk about bad faith users for just a second, because I'm in a business with a lot of bad faith individuals, not my colleagues, but a lot of bad faith users. And I was thinking yesterday about having a really wonderful AI model and improving the agents behind them that can ask ever more complicated questions. And if I were to ask something like, where would ISGS, that's the ISIS in the Greater Sahel, likely move into in the next 6 months? I'm curious about how open should that model be? Because maybe ISIS is thinking to themselves, listen, we need a bit of shake-up in our strategy. Let's go on these AI models and see what options do we have here, right? And I think that we presume that the users are using it to, for example, generate information for them to, as you were saying, apply to news stories. But there's an awful lot of bad faith users who can take advantage of these models unless we restrict in some ways who can access what information and for which purposes.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, thank you. So Eric, if you're still running Fast Company right now, would you sue OpenAI, or would you? Would you go into the partnership?
I actually have an answer for that. And I will say two things about conflict. I should sort of come clean about conflict of interest. I'm also, like Rajiv, a supporter of ScalePost. And the aspiration of ScalePost is to create a living marketplace for this data from newsrooms on an ongoing basis. And as Troy pointed out, right now the market is all over the place, and Reddit can strike a way better deal than The Atlantic for no discernible reason. and just because maybe they've got better negotiators or friends. So there should be a living marketplace, and that's what ScalePost aims to do. At the same time, one of my best friends is the lawyer representing OpenAI in the lawsuit with the New York Times. And the argument that he's given me on behalf of, which he's rehearsed with his client many times, is that all human creativity is a digestion of information that's come from other sources. So, you don't have to quote any, Nietzsche to realize that all art is theft, or whoever said that. And so that the copyright notion kind of falls short of the actual use case here. And so while, yes, there should be some money paid to content creators, who knows what it should be, and copyright precedent is not a very good model for us. Now, to answer your question, would I sue? I would sue OpenAI because I would be, not that anyone has asked me to do that, but because that particular lawsuit strikes me as a negotiating tactic. And it is basically the first step in setting the price for the New York Times content. But, so I flipped it. I would not sue that. I think that's just kind of a negotiating team. I would sue Cohere, though. I've joined that party. And there, I think the end game is not to strike a deal with this comparatively small company and split it among all those publishers that united behind it, but rather to create the legal precedent for what is the answer to copyright. And so I think there are a couple of things that make that argument plausible. Not that anyone at the United Publishers there has told me what their thinking is, but Cohere is a relatively small company, so that it cannot sort of win the knockdown, drag out, forever legal battle that Microsoft might be able to do. And also Cohere apparently, just from what I've read, may have kind of more openly, at least that's what the accusation is in the complaint, has more openly used like totally copyrighted and not pre-digested material. So it makes it a more legitimate target. And the end goal is not to extract money necessarily, or not only that, but to create the legal precedent, make a decision, to make the law adapt to the new reality.
Right.
One thing, a comment I want to make on Eric, what you said, another way to think of this is sort of from a philosophical perspective. If a professor reads all the New York Times articles and then teaches a class, and using what they've learned, does that professor need to pay a license fee? Most of us would argue no. Once AI becomes sentient or in some definition you say it is alive, then does that AI have the right to read all the content? Because it's, say, a living creature, at least by some definition, maybe like an alien creature, not a human creature.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in that kind of a scenario, it becomes more complicated. Does it have a right to read all this?
It's very interesting what you're saying. It's a little bit kind of off. Living being. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for all the answers. I'm going to ask the audience, please think about any questions. I want to ask like one really quick one. Get ready.
Okay.
I'll come to you. Just I've been overly critical towards AI, and we've been saying all these things. So, but let's talk about are you happy how the media actually covered AI in the last 2-3 years? What are your quick thoughts on that? Just to be fair.
I've had certain qualms about the way that we've covered AI. I think a lot of the anthropomorphizing of AI is harmful. I think a lot of AI doomerism and could be AI hype disguised, and we tend to sort of take that hook, line, and sinker. So I think it's difficult, when you feel that the only people who can explain a topic are the people who benefit financially from that topic. That's a tricky situation to negotiate.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's complicated. It depends on also even the people like Jeffrey Hinton, have one of the world's leading experts in this field, has claimed that it is kind of intelligent and alive, others or he didn't exactly say that, but kind of implied that. So I think
Remember that moment.
Yeah.
That was like
yes, I think the way the media has covered it, I also thought that the coverage of DeepSeek was a little interesting, that, it moved markets and so on. While it was great, it was a great product, I didn't think it was that amazing that it had to be covered everywhere, that it was a self-fulfilling thing that the media covered DeepSeek so much that it's disrupting so much that it began to actually happen.
Anyone else? You're fine.
Yeah.
All right, let's move to the questions. If you can just quickly say your name, say your name and let's start.
Yeah, I'm Abby at the Library of Congress, and I just want to go back to the copyright discussion and sort of the value of journalism. And it's another Norway anecdote. But so in Norway, they had their library, the Ministry of Culture had their library do a study because they want to build their own Norwegian large language model, and they're negotiating with the Norwegian publishers, to use all of the Norwegian language in it. They did a study of the impact of copyrighted materials in large language models, and they, used copyrighted data, different kinds of copyrighted data, and did different prompts and had PhD students score results and performance. And they found a lot of things, but the things I remember most was that the presence of nonfiction copyrighted language decreased performance in accuracy, fairness, and bias, which kind of makes sense. Copyrighted nonfiction increased performance. So I just wanted to share that because it may speak to the value of your particular content in these negotiations.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Candace Fortman. I am a current JSK fellow here at Stanford. But before that, I was running a small local newsroom in Detroit called Outlier Media, where we are using AI and our text-based news service that is providing Detroiters with custom news to help them navigate things like housing and water and utilities, things that people really need to survive in a place. And so I think my question is mostly for Troy, because you mentioned working with Michigan Radio. And I'm very interested because, so many of these conversations that I've heard while at Stanford are about large newsrooms, the New York Times and the AP, and, good for them. But a lot of news happens at the local level, and some of the most interesting experiments in news are happening at the local level. And so I'm very interested in what you all are doing, particularly with Michigan Radio, and also for those of you who are building things and thinking about building things, how are you working with local communities to bring that technology down to the community level?
Wonderful. Thank you, Candace.
Yeah, it's a great question. And while this stuff is expensive, so developing custom solutions has been the province of large news organizations. I've heard incredible amount of experimentation happening at the local level, happening in very small newsrooms, because you can use ChatGPT for not a lot of money. We definitely are thinking about our members and local news. And that's why when we created Local Lead, the whole idea was, how do we take this federal data set and make it relevant for local audiences, right? And when we did that, we brought in a cohort for a pilot. We said, is this useful? And they said, meh. So we revised it. We're still continuing to revise that to make it more useful for local audiences. But obviously it's something very important to us, right? Because AP doesn't exist without local news, right? But I do think that as the cost comes down and as it becomes sort of more mainstreamed, I don't know, and I'll say this, we've tried a lot of off-the-shelf tools that don't work in the newsroom. And we've had to create either custom versions of things or our own tools out of the box in order to meet our specific requirements. So I know that there are a lot of startups now trying to fill that gap, trying to create tools specifically for newsrooms, and hopefully they're creating tools that local newsrooms can use and can afford. But right now I feel like that there is that gap. You can't just go out and get something that's going to create the summaries and headlines, for example, for your newsroom. They're going to work perfectly. They're going to have to do some work to fine tune and make this really targeted to your need.
All right.
was going to mention that. So my concept of local is much more globalized in the sense that that we're present in every country, and so we have to come up with ways to make sure that the citizens of that country can get some sort of a often abbreviated but conflict news summary. So we've been doing this in Mozambique for quite a while, that we have a podcast on a radio that is in local languages telling them about the threats from the militia that's in the north. That was recently cut by the USAID issue, but it'll come back. I'm sure of it. But the idea is to do that in a much more widespread manner and on public radio, although on a public radio station, which is usually private. And the reason being is that that's how most people get their news. And so what we want to do is to make sure that there is a non-governmental source of news in the language that people can understand that will at least let them be aware of the risks around them so that they can take a little bit more control of the situation, which is often not the case.
Well, just one more thing about the Michigan Public Radio project. That was designed for people who are trying to cover city council meetings, right? Trying to cover very local issues, and it's been designed from scratch. I do think there's a natural kind of alliance there between the Documenters Project and what we're doing there. And we should, I think, and you should talk to everybody at the Documenters Project. Yeah. But it's really interesting. Like, how do you get the ears into the place where maybe we don't have a reporter? And this is about, being able to use the video to be those ears. But how do you line that up with the work that the Documenters is doing to get someone there to be present for those meetings?
So Troy, maybe just for context, what are the Documenters?
I don't want to. I want you to describe the Documenters project.
Just for everybody to.
Documenters is a program that was started by our colleague, actually, Bettina Chang, and 3 of her other colleagues in Chicago out of an organization called City Bureau. And they started just thinking that in Chicago they would build a residential model where residents would be trained. That is a very important word there. And then paid to go to city council meetings, school board meetings, to go to public meetings, to help newsrooms, which of course, as you all know, are increasingly small and unable to cover the meat and potatoes of what newsrooms really need to do in communities. That program is now in over 20 communities, including Detroit, where we run a Documenters program out of Outlier as a collaborative along with Michigan Radio. Yeah.
Thank you, Candace. Cheryl.
So 2 quick things. The first is we were talking about data and the threat of losing data and kind of how unprecedented that is. And it's just a little side note that just an hour ago there were over 900 people on a webinar from all across the U.S. talking about how they're going to be preserving data. So, and making sure, and folks from Harvard and Stanford and other places, nonprofit groups, and just individuals working to collect and harvest and preserve data. So that's just an aside. But it is actually related, just like it's related to the Documenters and related to what we're doing at Big Local News and what we're doing with WWK. And the question here is, how can you envision shifting the mindset to, I'm going to build my own LLM, to I'm going to build on top of this open, knowledge system,
Right.
and what will that do to this world? How could that shift it and kind of change the frame a little bit?
Rajiv?
I would say one thing. Unless companies have tremendous resources, most efforts to build an LLM, at least in the traditional definition of an LLM, the current level of technology are kind of doomed. It's not going to happen. Many companies have tried to do this. And even if you do build an LLM that can compete with sort of the current wave, in 2 months, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, they'll be way ahead of you. Look at how quickly after DeepSeek's introduction, other reasoning models have popped up. So I think the solution really is, one along the lines that you're building and designing. It's more than RAG. It doesn't have the baggage of fine tuning. You're not building an LLM from scratch, but you're really creating an agent and data architecture and a flow that would build on top of these open foundations. I think that's just going to happen. I don't even think people need to necessarily convince, because I would be surprised if media companies can just go build an LLM from scratch. That would be prohibitively expensive, even with DeepSeek's showing us that it can be done cheaper.
One of the things that I find a little bit frustrating about this moment is that we built a tool that does headlines, translations, summarization. I think Hearst built one. You know, everyone has built these same systems separately. Yeah. It seems like a bit of a waste of effort. I realize there are specific requirements from specific organizations, and I don't want to downplay that. But it does seem like there could be more collaboration, and that we could, pool our efforts more.
Right.
One thing I want to come back to that is, I wish that would happen. There have been some efforts in the media industry in the past, even back in the days of Night Reader, there was a Real Cities initiative. Sometimes they've gotten together to collaborate on things like NewsML and standards. I think with technology development, I would say I would love to see this happen if a whole bunch of news and media companies got together and built this agent LLM framework for things specific to journalism. I think there are a lot of perhaps political, other organizational issues that keep it from happening. But if there was a way to create it, and I don't know if a consortium or something is the answer, because those I've seen have mixed results too. And then there are vendors, companies like Nota that are building solutions, but then they don't have the news companies as a part of them. So I wonder if there was, I'm trying to think, in the past there have been other initiatives, like in the classified space when Night Reader, Gannett, and a bunch of companies got together, funded or bought and built, cars.com, apartments.com, all these shared things. So why not for LLMs and AI? That would be a fascinating project. Perhaps media companies partnering up with tech companies.
Or universities.
And universities. Yeah, especially
Big local,
both.
for example.
I hope we've learned from the days when we all made our own CMS.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Did you build your own? Next question, Darsh.
Hi, I'm Darshini. I'm a current JSK fellow. I'm from Malaysia. So I come here wearing many hats. So I was a journalist for many years, and I was a CEO and founder of a very small niche, keyword small, media startup in Malaysia. And I work in critical thinking and media literacy advocacy and training. So with that, I was very interested in two of the points that was brought up in the panel. One was, Dr. Raleigh, where you mentioned the gaps in information pool. And that has been a concern of mine even before AI, that gaps in data, especially concerning marginalized communities, were perpetuating bias and disinformation. What more with AI and hallucination? But at the same time, Rajiv, you mentioned that one of your advice was for newsrooms to use multiple AI tools. I'm not trying to be critical, but that is a luxury for big newsrooms with big funds. And so I'm trying to work with small media, niche, important media startups on a local front in Southeast Asia that helps these kind of communities. So in your opinion, and this is open to anyone in the panel, for these kind of small media startups who's trying to do important work to reach out to communities where data is lacking and hard to obtain, what should be prioritized? If I have a limited fund and I want to maximize this, should I prioritize training my staff on multiple AI tools, or should I invest, because we're seeing shrinking newsrooms, in getting these reporters and communities out and gathering data, often in the outskirts, different states, very hard to get data because it's very hard to do both, but it seems like we're being pulled and told to do both. So I really value your opinion on that. Thank you.
Well, I was just going to say, I would always go with the data. And of course, training persons to do it, because I think that there's a huge opportunity in partnering with other organizations to help you with the additional components to that. So we have a data science team. It's not enormous; they're very good, but so we partner in order to advance our skills. But I would never sacrifice not having a researcher in country so that I had a model.
I would add that, for organizations that have limited resources, the answer would be, I think a significant part of what you said, Troy, about having this consortium, or not consortium, but some kind of group that would, a collaborative effort. Because if that is being done by both smaller organizations and companies with bigger resources, you could take advantage of that. Another part of the solution is the work universities are doing. I think Professor Monica Lamb's work, and those kind of things would help. But ultimately, if you want to be able to compete, and then the open source models are also going to help. So if you want to use multiple LLMs, when the next Llama comes out, and then there is DeepSeek, and these could be used at a lower cost, so you could still have some of the luxury, not all of it. But I think it's really, not specific to this domain, but when an organization has limited resources, they can be more innovative, they can be more nimble, and they can get help from partnering with other organizations like themselves.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Mark Ralston. I am in the Sustainable Finance Initiative at Stanford. I will apologize for my question because I'm an economist.
No apology needed.
You mentioned in the prior question, are there historical examples that we can learn from? And I was jumping immediately to, in the late 90s, there were a number of very large, very profitable hedge funds that were doing natural language processing to read the press releases for earnings reports. And very quickly, the world shifted to using XBRL to send out their earnings announcements. So it was all machine readable instantly. And what I would assume is going to happen is we're going to have providers of news using AI to write things, and consumers of news using AI to read things. And eventually, again, economist, the market's going to be pretty efficient. They're going to drill down against each other and end up with some concept of truth that'll look a lot like XBRL, because they will just be getting more and more powerful, fighting each other to sort through what's the shading of the provider of the news and the interpretation by the reader of the news. And the answer is we're going to end up with a phenomenally expensive, computationally intensive XBRL.
And that's why economics is called the dismal science.
Anyone wants to take this one? No?
I don't know the
Okay.
history.
Yeah, not familiar with XBRL. The rest of what you said, makes
resonated.
sense. It resonates.
Yeah.
But not super familiar with XBRL. So.
I guess the idea is that AI will read AI, will produce AI, and then AI will talk to AI. No humans involved, right?
So so what the XBRL did is it said, you used to write a press release that says our earnings per share were this, and this, and this gap number was this, and this other gap number is that, and it was just text. And so these hedge funds figured out how to read the text. And then eventually it became your actual SEC filings of your earnings announcement was just code. So everyone could read it instantly, perfectly.
I like the idea that it takes care of your admin, right? But I also think that in terms of journalism, like it's still somebody's eyeballs that need to read it, right? And I think that as I was saying before, the appetite for AI generated media, I think, will be pretty limited in the sense, I think it doesn't have the same tenor and texture that a person does. I think there'll be a premium on human generated work, but I think it will never go as the main way people consume something.
I mean, I agree with that to a certain extent, but I do think that there are sort of two kinds of two ways of consuming news, right? One is what is actionable, and this is your case here. We're looking for what is actionable, what's going to move markets, right? So, no?
Well, I guess Monica's work is trying to put a very tight structure on horribly unstructured data. Mm-hmm. And as we get better and better at that, it will, someone's going to have an LLM or some tool that Monica develops that reads the beautiful text that is, and that is written by a human journalist and just sucks out the facts and takes the opinions and the language that conveys opinion out of it to say, here's what matters. That's what, this was what was happening with the earnings releases in the late 90s. And so then people are going to have LLMs that are going to say, well, we're going to try to make it so you can't take the opinion out or take the emotion out. And so you're just gonna have this arms race between the consumers, the consuming LLMs that are trying to sort out the facts and the producing LLMs that are trying to shade the facts. Or, it just seems like it's a repeated play game theory problem. And that's just what's going on. The LLMs are just going to be fighting with each other to arrive at some structural concept of what is true.
But I think the notion there, the given there is that we can extract facts from it. And in some cases, some kinds of reporting, you can't, right? There are ways that you can turn unstructured data into structured data. There are other kinds of reporting where the experience of reading it conveys information. How it is phrased, that is part of what you come to it for. As a news consumer, I go to The Atlantic for a certain kind of experience that carries with it information. But what I want, what I'm looking for as a consumer, the value can't be extracted away from the way it's written.
I would just add to that, is that in the surveys that we've done at the Alliance, people always say, I want a news source that gives me just the facts. And their actual behavior of where they go and where they get their news belies that. And I think what people are looking for is something deeper and a more emotional resonance. Troy gets it, and so do I, from reading The Atlantic and seeing the kind of beautiful wordsmithing, but also kind of on a more emotional or tribal level, a sense that, as I was talking before about trust, is that these people get me. These people understand the issues that concern me, and the way they see the world confirms the way I see the world. And that goes well beyond facts.
All right. Let's go to the left.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful panel. My name is Leah Harrison. I'm a journalist. I worked for many years at Bloomberg News, and I'm currently at Stanford working in a Brown research grant in data talk with Cheryl. My question goes back to some of the content licensing deals that have been struck between AI providers and news publishers. It's interesting the two of you are working with ScalePost. It seems to me like everyone is massively undervaluing their content. These are very deep-pocketed companies. I would like to think that we could, milk them for the funds we need to rebuild local newsrooms. Why couldn't we have a world where we could do that, where there could be some type of tolling mechanism like there has been for the music industry, where, publishers and journalists are paid for their work?
That's the aspiration. I'll leave the question about milking to sort of the negotiators, but yeah, that's the idea of having sort of an ongoing tolling at a place where the market clears.
All right, thank you.
Is that happening now? Why can't we get the price up?
I think there's probably just not enough market participants, and the market is so new that people don't, including the media companies, don't know how to value what happens behind the curtain at an LLM. But Rajiv, I don't know, how would you answer that?
I think I would concur with what you say and what you said, and I think what goes on behind the scenes at an LLM, one can suspect, but we don't really know. So, yeah, I don't have more to add on that. Yeah.
All right, let's try to get more questions.
Can I just follow up on her question there?
All right, quick follow-up, David.
Just quick follow-up. We need some transparency from AP on this and in disclosing their AI deal, because we do need to set the market rate. AI has the potential of killing the goose that laid the golden egg of valuable information. We have AI companies with multi-billion-dollar valuations and news companies going into bankruptcy. So there is value in what we have, and we can't just let them suck the news industry dry and leave us as a husk as they go off to their billion-dollar valuation. So let's disclose our deals.
Well, we don't disclose our deals with anyone else. So this would be a big exception. However,
It's worthwhile.
However, I do know that there are member news organizations who are talking with our revenue side right now about that experience and what they've learned. And that's a role that I think AP can play. Can we help other news organizations understand how to value their content and, working with other kinds of structures like they're talking about. Yeah, I think we should share that knowledge. We're not going to publish that knowledge, right?
All right, let's two more questions. Questions on the right.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Jorge Rivera. I'm with the One Campaign, which is an advocacy and campaigning organization. And, you know, in advocacy, when you do that kind of professionally as your raison d'etre as an organization, it's about shining a light, not in a dissimilar way to journalists, right? Who are trying to bring some information, bring some data, paint a picture of something. And one thought is, you know, a lot of the tools that you're developing in this context as journalism could very well apply to the advocacy side, right? Where you're trying to get better, easier access to information and be able to pass it on in some way. It's just that your readers are potentially people who can do something about it, who are influential in the policy sense. So I wonder what's the space for that to be not just for journalists, but for people who are trying to affect change in some way. But the other challenge that I see is that all of these things ultimately make it easier to produce data, facts, knowledge, information. And we're already in such a crowded space of trying to cut through with data. Like the essence of one is to be data-driven advocacy, you know, organization. And so that means that we come with facts and try to convince people because we're showing them data, we're showing them facts. That's really hard when everyone is doing the same and it's happening at such a speed that where do you focus, right? So I'm wondering about your take on this and whether the solution to a problem like that is to go much more specific, right? So part of the challenge is we're all working with the same facts, so it's easy to ignore when you're hearing the same information coming from many different places. But what if you could tailor that? Because now you have tools that make it easy to tailor what the end user is seeing, right? Your audiences, our audiences are politicians, for example. Or whether the solution, you know, is something totally different, right? I'm not entirely sure how do you continue to cut through in the age of producing knowledge in an AI-augmented way.
Any reaction from the panel?
I'm not sure facts move action in that way. I would think it would, but I don't think it does. I think there's a danger in calling yourself an advocate these days, in part because I think that the expectation is that you've manipulated those facts in order to have a particular outcome. So I think it's pretty good to say that you've analyzed something and here's the results of your analysis, because it feels less biased than for someone to say, oh, that's really interesting and I'd like to hear more about it. But it's been a tumultuous few years with advocacy, and I think people are wary, I guess, of it.
Okay, last question, Ryan.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm a current JSK fellow here at Stanford as well. My background is in data journalism and building tools for journalists to use, and more recently at a nonprofit that helps other people do more of that kind of work. Troy, I really loved your point about how every beat is a data journalism beat. I believe in that. Thinking a little bit about Djordje's last question, how has the media been covering the AI industry? I think we maybe need to expand that a little bit and consider that every beat is an AI beat at this point. Yeah. Thinking about your note about automation bias, the Washington Post a couple weeks ago published a story about people who have been charged and wrongfully convicted after being only identified by AI-driven facial recognition. In these cases, they were just completely wrong. The cops had total trust. They said this was a 100% match, this person who has been identified by this facial recognition system, and they brought charges against them completely wrong. Right? You have teachers who are being held accountable by algorithmic decision-making. They're losing their jobs. You have books like Automating Inequality and Algorithms of Oppression. These books are like 5 or 6 years old. They're full of examples of how these algorithms are having material effects on people's lives. And in many cases, the journalists that we have covering these beats, like crime and education, these are the least experienced journalists that we have. So what do we do for our industry to prepare us to help other people understand how these algorithmic decision-making systems, these AIs, are affecting all of us?
Yeah, I think it's essential. I think the AI beat can't be relegated to the tech beat, right? It's not limited. It doesn't only affect our lives in the ways that, tech companies' stock prices move. So, one of the things that we did, we had one of our fantastic investigative reporters, Poppy Burke, who's the byline is Garance Burke, not only did she do a series, the track series exposing a lot of these kinds of issues that you're talking about, the kind of the algorithmic bias baked into the ways that governments are making decisions. But she also really helped guide our style book team in creating the AI chapter. There's a long section on covering AI, right? And it's really written for a general audience, like any beat reporter, an education reporter can pick this up and kind of think through some of the questions to ask. When your school district starts adopting AI technology in whatever administrative function, here are some ways that you can think about. Here's some questions you can ask. We've done some training, reporting on AI across the beats. We're going to do more of that. But I think you're absolutely right. We need this kind of awareness across every beat of how AI is impacting your people.
Thank you, Troy. And we're already over time. Just wanted to give the opportunity for your last message if you want to share something, or I can do like a quick question for the end. 10 or 20 years from now, will AI be transforming journalism in a good way or in a bad way? Just quick. Troy.
I don't think we can see past 10 months, much less 10 years, in terms of what AI is going to do. I do think that journalism will look vastly different. The business model will look vastly different. That's got to be expected now. That's the writing is on the wall. How that plays out and the role that AI plays in it, AI will obviously play a role. I think I'd be foolish to try to guess.
As I'm not a journalist, I'll say that I think knowledge management will be very different very quickly. And I think that's a positive development.
I would say not only knowledge and information AI is going to transform, but even the physical world as well. So I think it's in that the time frame you mentioned is exceptionally hard to predict.
Right. I'll say only all the consequences will be unforeseen.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's give it a round of applause to our wonderful panel. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. This was great.